Hamilton Bennett was a very conscientious and patriotic young fellow here in Kilburn City, Wisconsin. The Civil War came about, and he certainly thought it was a patriotic thing to do to enlist in the military. And he signed up in the 12th Wisconsin Infantry, Company E, which actually was composed of young men from this area of Wisconsin.
And they had a great time training together and marching back and forth and playing pranks with each other. Bennett kept a daily journal, which I recorded in my book, and he actually enjoyed being in the Army. He liked the camaraderie, and he didn't like the shooting. At the end, he said he liked everything about the Army except the killing. He didn't like that.
And it was a kind of exciting time in his life for him, but eventually they sent him off to the war. And Bennett was in the Battle of Vicksburg in July of 1863, one of the major battles of the Civil War. Came through that battle just fine. But later on that year, there was a skirmish. And he went to step up on a tree stump or a boulder to take a shot with his gun. And as he did that, he was stepping up on the boulder. He used his weapon, his gun, as kind of a walking stick, and he put his hand over the barrel to climb up on the tree stump or rock, and at that time the safety failed and the gun went off.
He accidentally shot himself in the hand. It's questionable whether that was an accident or whether it was on purpose, because at that point he was eager to get back home.
And of course the military medical people in that time weren't nearly as sophisticated as they are today. And at first they thought they might have to amputate his right hand. But Bennett really did not want that to happen, or did not allow that to happen. And eventually his right hand healed, but he lost the use of his hand except for his thumb and his third finger. So later that year they mustered him out of the military, and he returned back here to Kilburn City and began his life again.
Henry Hamilton Bennett may have been born in the small town of Brattleboro, Vermont, but his legend lies within a place that is known around the world today for its water parks, amusement parks, and tourism appeal, but most importantly, for its unique and beautiful landscape. This place is now known globally as the Wisconsin Dells, but on any map from the late 1800s, you would only find the name Kilburn City in its place. The next half hour will tell the story of an adventuresome, inventive, and artistic pioneer in the art of landscape photography with the help of two experts, Dale Williams, the site director of the H.H. Bennett Studio Museum, and Sara Rath, Bennett biographer and author of H.H. Bennett Photographer, His American Landscape. My name is Brad Galley, and I will be your host for this evening. After returning home from the war, Bennett was forced to find a new means of business. His hand injury rendered his carpentry skills useless, so he decided to try his hand at photography, and quickly took a liking to it. He married his first wife, Frances Dowdy, and together they ran a photography business. Frances did the portrait work, while Henry went out to explore and photograph Kilburn's natural wonders. Little did he know, the pictures that he took would have a huge effect on the then little-known town of Kilburn.
Well, H.H.'s story is very unusual. He was a young fella. He was the oldest of 12 children in his family. They were living at the time in Brattleboro, Vermont. And his dad was having a tough time making a living out there, and decided he wanted to come out here to the west to see if he could get established. So his dad and one of Bennett's uncles came out here with young H.H. when he was just 14 years of age. And they came here to this little town that was just started up of Kilburn City in 1857. And it was just literally a year after they formed the community. At the same time, the railroad was building a wooden bridge, a structure across the Wisconsin River.
His father then went back to Vermont very soon after that, and Henry stayed on and took care of himself. He did lathing in houses and other carpentry work. But it wasn't long before the war began, and then he signed up for the Army. So he came back to Kilburn City with his right hand quite mangled. He only had the use of his thumb and one finger. Before he'd gone in the service, he was a carpenter. So when he came back to Kilburn City, he had no trade to go back to, and Leroy Gates' tintype studio was for sale. So he purchased the tintype studio and decided that he would go into the photography business with his brother Georgie, who had assisted their Uncle George back in Brattleboro, Vermont, and knew the trade.
And he'd also been dating a young lady here in the Kilburn City area. Her name was Frances Dowdy. He called her Frankie. And she became pregnant. So they were married in Lake Delton, and he had to find a way to support this new wife and child. And he went to work in 1865 doing portrait work. And most of the work in those days was mothers bringing their children in for a portrait. It took a very long exposure time, depending upon the light level, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, sometimes even longer. And many times these children were young and rambunctious, and of course they moved, and the images were blurred, and the mothers grumbled to Bennett, and he referred to these people as his victims. So the second year, in 1866, they tried to do something different, and he got Frankie and the baby and a tent, and he got on the train and he went up to Toma.
And he thought that he would travel around southwest Wisconsin taking pictures of people and make a living that way, but there was other competition. There was a photographer in Portage, there were other photographers around, and it was very difficult economically. They had a baby right away, and so eventually he became extremely discouraged and came back to Kilburn City and took over the Gates studio again and began doing regular photography.
Only this time they did something different. Frankie took over the portrait work, freeing Bennett to go out along the river that he knew so well. And he said he just loved to take pictures of these rock formations. He could open the shutter of his camera and leave it open as long as he wanted, and the rocks didn't move on him.
So one of the first cameras that he used for taking stereo pictures was made out of a cigar box, according to his son. And he would take the picture and then he would move it 2.5 inches to the side and take another picture, because our eyes are about 2.5 inches apart, and so the stereo pictures are the same picture but taken from a perspective of 2.5 inches further, so that when you look at this, the two of them through a stereoscope, your brain puts it together into one picture, and items in the foreground stand out and have a stereo image. Eventually he did make a camera that had 2 lenses so that he didn't have to move it from side to side.
And Bennett produced these early stereo views, and they were sold by agents around the country and later by catalogs. And this was quite popular. In fact, from all the 1860s up until really the 1930s or so, every parlor, every living room in America usually had a stereo viewer. And that's really the way that people started hearing about the dells of the Wisconsin River. And many of them decided they wanted to come up here and see these beautiful rock formations for themselves. Now at the same time, the railroad was already running through town, and they saw a lot of commercial appeal in this. So they hired Bennett to do additional photos, which they would put up in their railroad stations from Chicago, eventually all the way up to St. Paul, Minnesota. And as people would see these images, they could buy a trip on the train, and they could come here to Kilburn City, and they could take the early boat rides, which started out with simple rowboats or john boats rowed by one individual up the river. And later on, the first steamboats came in about 1875.
And when the steamboats started going up the dells, and he would take pictures of the tourists before they got on the boat, and then when they came back, he would be able to sell them the photographs of the group before they went on the boat.
That's really how tourism started in this community. So eventually, so many people referred to this as the dells, or the dells of the Wisconsin River, that eventually in 1931 they changed the name of the town from Kilburn City to Wisconsin Dells. It's known around the world today.
As Bennett's stereographs and photographs became more and more popular, so did the dells of the Wisconsin River. People flocked from all over the nation and the world to come see the magnificent sights that were present in Bennett's photos. They even caught the eye of an art collector, factory owner, and Milwaukee resident named William Metcalf. When Metcalf first saw Henry Hamilton's work, he was so taken by Bennett's artistic eye that he hopped on a train to Kilbourne City to meet the man behind the photos in person. Not surprisingly, when the two met, they hit it off. Bennett enjoyed the company and criticism of William Metcalf so much so that he decided to bring Metcalf along on a trip to meet a few of the Native Americans of the area and to give Metcalf lessons on taking his own striking photos. Shortly after their trip, Metcalf saw it fit to lend his new friend money to build what would be the most advanced photographic studio in the world at the time. With this new studio, Metcalf figured Bennett could rid him of the burdens of the old Gates tintype studio and redirect his attention to improving upon what was already a great natural talent. After their initial acquaintance, Metcalf and Bennett continued to be great friends, and until his death, Metcalf served as Bennett's #1 critic. In his new studio, which remains in the same place now as it did back then, Bennett invented, created, and made huge breakthroughs in the photographic industry. In fact, Bennett is credited for both perfecting the idea of an instantaneous shutter and for being one of the first photojournalists in the world. Let's take a look.
William Metcalf is a very interesting individual. He was an industrialist, had businesses in the Milwaukee area, including a large boot manufacturing company. But he had an artistic bent and artistic background. He was very interested in the arts.
He liked to paint on weekends. He would go out in the country with an easel. He had a very good eye. He collected art. He had a gallery in his home.
And when he found out about Bennett's photography, he would get on a train and come up here to Kilbourne City, looking over these very artfully produced photo images. And from Bennett, he learned a lot about photography.
And they went on a camping trip up in Adams and Juneau County, and he had such a wonderful time taking pictures and being with these guys, and they ate hard-boiled eggs and drank rum, and it was sort of like an old boys party. And he just took such a liking to Bennett and really appreciated his artistic talent, so much so that he realized Bennett would not be able to express this talent with a studio as impoverished as the Leroy Gates tintype studio was.
And in the mid-1870s, Bennett wanted to, one of his tasks or goals was to build his own photography studio. He had been renting this old tintype studio for many years, but he wanted to build his own and put the latest ideas of photography and some of his own ideas into it. He just had one problem. He didn't have the money to do it.
So he loaned Bennett the money to build the studio that has been reproduced on this site. And Bennett and Metcalf remained very good friends throughout Metcalf's life.
We've talked about Bennett being not only a great photographer, but he was also quite an inventor. And he was here operating this little town of Kilbourne City, Wisconsin, all by himself, but he was reading some of the photography journals and seeing what was going on, not only in the United States, but around the world. And he saw some of the problems with photography, and he set out to tackle some of them on his own.
One of the reasons for his many inventions was that he was isolated out here in a very rural area, but also because some things didn't work as well as he thought they should.
And Bennett had been encouraged to see if he could invent some kind of what he called an instantaneous shutter.
He thought that he could be very innovative, and perhaps he read a lot about the ones that were in existence. You know, times were never easy for him. He never had money to do anything. So he probably just experimented until he got these rubber bands to work.
And later on, he perfected it with levers on the actual lens of the camera outside of the body that allowed him to take a very close to stop action photo. And he perfected that in 1886. And that was also the year that he used that very successfully to take his most famous icon picture of his son Ashley making that jump to Stand Rock, jumping that chasm underneath.
when he took the picture of Ashley jumping to Stand Rock, it was thought to be a fake, or a humbug as they called it at the time, because such pictures were so rare, to stop action photos were so rare. After he had developed the snapper, he and his son Ashley arranged to go with the Arpin Lumber Company from Wisconsin Rapids and go down through the rapids from north of Kilburn City down to Boscobel on these rafts of, or these cribs of lumber.
He spent 3 weeks traveling with Ashley and recording this really interesting and dangerous rafting situation. And Bennett's actually credited as one of the first photojournalists.
The snapper allowed him to take pictures of doing the rapids, and with things moving all the time, it would have been very hard for him to keep things in focus, so that made that possible, and it is said to have been one of the first examples of photojournalism. So it's quite remarkable when you put all of the slides together.
After many, many years of great success, Bennett would eventually face an unavoidable downturn in the popularity of professionally produced photographs. Due to the invention of roll film and the Brownie camera by George Eastman around 1883, people were able to take their own photographs without the overpriced and pesky fees of a professional. Sadly, shortly thereafter, Frankie Dowdy, Bennett's first wife, passed away, and Bennett plunged into a deep depression. Henry blamed himself for the death of his beloved because of the chemicals that she worked with inside the darkroom when she was developing portraits. For quite a while after Frankie's death, Bennett would go in and out of depression, but eventually he met what would become his second wife, Eveline Marshall. Now, Eveline wasn't an easy person to get to agree to marry with, however. After a couple rejections and endless pleading, Bennett finally got Eveline to agree to marry him. Fortunately for Bennett, his will not to back down wasn't in vain, because the two had a very successful marriage that led to the birth of 2 more children for Bennett. But as Bennett's personal life improved, the photographic industry did not. And although the business still had to rely more heavily on souvenirs for survival than actual pictures, Bennett never stopped taking photos. Even after he was diagnosed with Bright's disease and the dells of the Wisconsin River were threatened by the building of a dam, Bennett fought, quite literally, to his death to protect the place he called home.
Frankie Doty Bennett died of consumption in 1884, and that was after Henry had been told by a doctor that a change of scenery might improve her health.
And Bennett had taken her out to the west, to Arizona, to see if the atmosphere out there would be better for her, and she didn't do well.
She lived for some time after that, but her health diminished continually, and she finally died, and this plunged him into an extremely deep depression. He thought perhaps the work that Frankie had done in the cold, damp, darkroom had contributed to her ill health, and so he felt very guilty, and he was miserable without her.
It was a tough time in life for him. Bennett would go through bouts of depression. He would have these 3 children that were teenagers at the time. The stereo review market was declining. His wife had died. It was just a tough time in his life. But a few years later, he started dating another young lady here in town. Her name was Eveline Marshall. And she was a quite attractive young lady, but she was 20 years younger than Bennett.
She was about the age of his daughter, Hattie. And so Hattie and Nellie, his other daughter, were not really keen on the idea.
He pursued her and proposed to her. She turned him down. He worked on her dad. He worked on her brother. And Eveline left and went up to St. Paul, and Bennett followed her up there, proposed again. And while she was up there, she told him that she would consider his proposal. And he waited every day for a letter from Eveline, and he did not receive that letter for quite a while. And eventually he received one from her, and she said no. But then, mysteriously, Eveline changed her mind, and a few weeks later she came back here to Kilburn City, agreed to marry him, and they were married in 1890. And that was a very successful marriage too. Eventually they had 2 children, Miriam and Ruth.
Well, there came a time when the photographs weren't selling as well, and they had to buy more and more Indian merchandise from the local Menominees, and that was extremely difficult. I was told that after the first basket order they made to a basket company out east, that Eveline cried all night. She could see the beginning of the end of the photography business, and that they had to depend more and more on souvenirs for their living.
Well, Bennett was an interesting individual. We talked about Bennett as an excellent landscape photographer, as an inventor and a promoter, but he was also basically what we would call an environmentalist today. He really appreciated nature and the beauty of the dells of the Wisconsin River. And when the Southern Wisconsin Power Company came in the area and talked about building a dam on the Wisconsin River, Bennett very much opposed it. He went to Congress. He tried to oppose it on all levels. He didn't want to see this dam built, and his beautiful upper dells flooded, and a lot of these beautiful rock formations he'd photographed changed literally forever.
He spent a lot of time trying to fight the dam, and that began to take up most of his effort and sapped his strength, I think, and his emotions.
So he fought it, but he lost the battle. They said that the future of Kilburn City was not tourism, but it was factories, and they had to have a lot of electricity.
He wrote a lot of letters, contacted a lot of people, but it was, in his heart, he probably knew it was futile, and it broke his heart. His family says he died of a broken heart.
And Bennett died in 1908. In 1909, that dreaded dam went online and flooded, at least the dam, a good 17 feet of the beautiful dells of the Wisconsin River.
The electricity provided was used to run the streetcars in Watertown. That was what happened with the electricity that the dam provided, and Kilburn never became a manufacturing town. He was a brave, adventuresome young boy, and he retained that sense of adventure as an adult. But he also had a very artistic eye, and he was an extremely kind man and a romantic. So I think every biographer falls in love with their subject, and I couldn't help but feel extremely affectionate toward him and toward the story of his life.
This concludes the story of the life of a revolutionary, an environmentalist, and a person that truly had passion in what he did for a living. Whether you wish to believe it was merely accident that Henry Hamilton Bennett became a photographer, or whether it was fate, one thing is clear. He was a pioneer as important as the landscapes he photographed. Thank you for joining me. I'm Brad Galley. Have a wonderful night.